My son sent me a lemon birthday cake with a short note. Enjoy it alone, Dad. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law, Leonie, and the kids unexpectedly came by to visit me. So, I cut the cake and shared it with them. At 9:07 p.m., my phone rang. My son screamed so sharply that I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Why did you let them eat it?" His breathing was rushed and desperate, his voice trembling as if he had just witnessed something terrible happen. In that moment, I suddenly realized that the birthday cake wasn't as simple as I had thought. Hello everyone, welcome to the story. Before we continue, like the video, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I'd also like to wish you a wonderful day wherever you are. This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes, with some dramatized details to make the narrative more engaging and offer meaningful insights. I woke on my 72nd birthday, March the 16th, 2021, to the doorbell cutting through the quiet of my Chapel Hill home. The sun painted the kitchen in soft golden light that reminded me of my late wife. I wasn't expecting anything. Corbin had been distant for months, too busy to return my calls. So, when I found a pristine white bakery box on my porch with a small envelope tucked under the ribbon, my heart swelled with naive hope that my son still remembered me. I carried the box inside and set it on my kitchen table. The envelope was expensive stationery with Corbin's law school penmanship. I opened it with trembling fingers. "Happy birthday, Dad. Enjoy this alone. You deserve a quiet celebration after all these years of noise. Take the day for yourself. Love, Corbin." I read the note 3 times each pass, tightening my chest with gratitude and melancholy. "Enjoy this alone." The phrasing was odd, almost clinical, but I convinced myself it was Corbin's awkward way of telling me to rest. Have you ever been so grateful for a scrap of attention that you ignore the warning bells? I opened that box like a treasure chest. Inside was a perfect lemon sponge cake, 3 layers high, with pale yellow buttercream frosting, piped with professional precision. The scent of citrus and vanilla transported me back to Sunday mornings, when my wife used to bake. I ran my finger along the frosting edge and tasted it sweet with just a hint of tartness. It was perfect, too perfect. I placed the cake on the counter, deciding to wait until evening to honor Corbin's instruction. I spent the morning in my study with old photo albums. I hadn't heard from Leonie or the grandchildren, assuming they were respecting Corbin's wishes for my quiet day. But around 4 p.m., I heard small feet running up my driveway, and Leonie's voice calling out in a conspiratorial whisper, "Surprise, Grandpa." The door burst open. There they were, Ren 10 years old with her mother's sharp blue eyes and a homemade birthday crown, and Milo, 6 years old, clutching a drawing of us fishing. Leonie stood behind them, flushed and apologetic, but glowing with warmth. "I know Corbin said you wanted a quiet day, but the kids insisted. We won't stay long, just wanted to see you blow out a candle." My heart, which had been quietly aching all day, suddenly felt full. I pulled them all into a hug, the smell of Leonie's jasmine perfume, and Milo's grape juice-stained fingers grounding me in pure, uncomplicated love. "Well, if we're breaking the rules," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "then we're doing it properly. I've got a cake, and it's big enough for all of us." I brought the lemon cake to the dining table. Leonie lit a single candle from her purse. The children sang off-key, their voices filling my house with the kind of noise I'd been told to avoid. I cut 4 generous slices, watching Ren and Milo dig in with childhood enthusiasm. Leonie took a small bite, complimenting the bakery's skill, while I savored mine, slowly thinking how lucky I was that they'd defied Corbin's directive. The taste was sweet, almost too sweet. There was a faint bitter aftertaste I couldn't quite place, but I dismissed it as lemon zest. "This is really good, Grandpa." "Did you pick the flavor?" Ren asked, her mouth full of frosting. I shook my head, smiling. "Your dad chose it. He knows lemon was Grandma's favorite." It was only later, when the screaming started, that I realized Corbin hadn't chosen lemon out of sentimentality. He had chosen it to mask the chemical bitterness of crushed pills hidden inside. We spent another hour laughing, letting Milo show me his drawing in excruciating detail. Leonie kept glancing at her phone, frowning slightly. Around 6 p.m., they left the children sticky and happy. I cleaned up, wrapped the leftover cake, and settled into my armchair with a book and tea. The house fell back into familiar silence, but this time it was warm silence, the kind that follows laughter. Then at 9:07 p.m., the phone shattered everything. I saw Corbin's name on the caller ID, and for a split second, I thought he was calling to thank me. But the voice that exploded through the receiver was unrecognizable, a raw, jagged scream. "What did you do? Dad, what did you do to them? His words were frantic, breathless, punctuated by crashing sounds. Corbin, slow down. What are you talking about? I shouted back, my book falling to the floor. The kids, they're on the floor. They're not breathing right. Leonie's throwing up. What did you put in that cake? His voice cracked on cake, the accusation hitting me like a physical blow. I didn't put anything in it. Corbin, you sent it to me. Why did you let them eat it? I told you to enjoy it. Alone, you were supposed to eat it alone. He was sobbing now, a sound so raw it didn't sound human. The line went dead, the sharp click echoing like a gunshot. I stood in my living room, the phone pressed to my ear, my mind racing to catch up with the horror unfolding. You were supposed to eat it alone. The words looped in my head, and with each repetition the truth crystallized like frost on glass. The cake wasn't a gift, it was a weapon, and I had just shared my execution with the people I love most. I grabbed my keys, my hands shaking violently, as I tore out of my driveway tires, screeching. One thought hammered against my skull. If I was supposed to eat it alone, then what was in that cake? And why is my son screaming like his plan just fell apart? The sliding glass doors of the ER didn't open fast enough, so I threw my shoulder against them, the scent of antiseptic instantly replacing the lingering sweetness of the lemon cake that still clung to my clothes. My mind was a storm of screeching tires and Corbin's accusatory screams. The cake he had sent me, the one I'd opened like a treasure that morning, now felt like a bomb that had detonated in the hands of the people I love most. I spotted Leonie immediately. She was collapsed in a plastic chair near the admitting desk, her yoga clothes wrinkled and her usually perfect blonde hair hanging in loose, frantic strands around her face. Thane, they just stopped. They just stopped breathing properly. She sobbed, her hands reaching out to clutch my forearms with a strength born of pure terror. Before I could even find the words to comfort her, the double doors leading to the trauma bays swung open with a violent crash. Paramedics were wheeling 2 stretchers at a sprint. I caught a fleeting soul-crushing glimpse of Milo and Ren. Their faces were the color of damp chalk, their small bodies eerily still against the white sheets. Out of the way, sir. We need a clear path to trauma 2. A technician barked, nearly shoving me into a vending machine as they vanished into the restricted zone. Have you ever heard the sound of a heart monitor flatlining? Even through the heavy doors, the clinical high-frequency chirping of monitors seemed to drill into my skull, creating an atmosphere of clinical dread. I stood there frozen, the weight of 72 years, finally proving too heavy for a man whose own son had turned a birthday gift into a weapon. Corbin arrived 10 minutes later. He didn't rush to Leonie. He didn't come to me for a status report. He stood in the far corner of the waiting room, his tailored suit jacket unbuttoned, his chest heaving. His eyes were darting frantically not toward the trauma doors where his children were fighting for their lives, but toward the nurse's station and the security desk. When I tried to approach him, he physically recoiled as if I were a leper. "Don't touch me, Dad," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous vibration. "You've done enough." I recoiled as if he'd struck me. "I only shared your cake with them, Corbin. The cake you sent me. Why would you say I've done anything?" I whispered, my heart breaking in real time. He didn't answer. He only turned his back, staring out the window at the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers that were just pulling into the bay. I sank into the chair beside Leonie, our shoulders touching, but our spirits miles apart in the shared silence. I noticed Corbin checking his watch surreptitiously, his fingers tapping a frantic rhythm on his thigh. He wasn't acting like a father waiting for a miracle. He was behaving like a man waiting for a timer to go off. The accusation in his voice, "You've done enough," echoed in my skull. What had I done except open the gift he sent and share it with the family he claimed to love? Nearly an hour of agonizing silence passed before the doors opened again. Dr. Sarah Kim, the attending physician at UNC Medical Center, approached us with a clipboard clutched tightly against her white coat. She didn't offer a smile. Her expression was unreadable, but grave. "Mr. Garrison, we've stabilized them for the moment, but we found something in their systems that shouldn't be there." She began, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. She led us into a small private consultation room that smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. "This wasn't bacteria," she continued, her voice dropping into a register that made the hair on my arms stand up. "It was a concentrated dose of an ACE inhibitor, a blood pressure medication. We found evidence of extreme bradycardia. In both children, their heart rates dropped to dangerously low levels almost immediately after ingestion. Doctor, Kim leaned forward, her gaze softening slightly, but her questions remaining sharp. She asked about the cake, where it came from, who prepared it when we ate it. I explained that Corbin had it delivered that morning, that I'd only opened the box and shared it with Leonie and the children when they surprised me. Then she paused, looking at my medical history on her tablet. "Mr. Garrison, I see you are prescribed lisinopril for your hypertension," she said, her voice clinical. "Do you keep those pills in your home?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing back to my unlocked bathroom cabinet. I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins that the poison wasn't a rare chemical. It was my own life-saving medication, the very thing that kept my heart beating, that had been used to try and stop theirs. "But I didn't make that cake, doctor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My son had it delivered to me. Someone had to have taken my medication before the cake ever arrived at my door." As Dr. Kim looked at me with a mix of pity and dawning understanding, I realized that my son hadn't just blamed me for a mistake, he had orchestrated this entire nightmare. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of heavy official boots echoing down the hallway. I looked toward the waiting room, through the small window where Corbin was still avoiding my gaze, and I knew that the man I had raised was gone. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the word poison when it's directed at a father, a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the very air out of my lungs. I sat in that small consultation room, the clinical hum of a nearby vending machine sounding like a roar in the vacuum of my shock. "Doctor?" Kim held the toxicology report with a steady hand, but her eyes held a flicker of something that looked like mourning. My own medication, my lisinopril. The little orange pills that kept my blood pressure in check had been repurposed into a weapon against my own blood. Dr. Kim laid the paper on the table. "It's not just a trace, Mr. Garrison. It was enough to stop their hearts," she said, her voice dropping into a register of grim necessity. "We found lethal concentrations of lisinopril crushed directly into the center slices of the lemon cake." I closed my eyes, trying to piece together the timeline. The bakery box had arrived sealed that morning. The cake inside had been pristine, professional, untouched, which meant the poison had been added before it was delivered, or my medication had been taken days, maybe weeks before, to prepare for this exact moment. Do you want to know what it feels like to realize you've been a secondary character in your son's murder plot? It feels like drowning in shallow water. I looked at Leonie, and for the first time since we arrived, the terror in her eyes was being replaced by a sharp, investigative focus. "Thane, remember, last Sunday," she asked, her voice trembling, but gaining strength. "Corbin never helps with the dishes. He hates domestic work, but he insisted on cleaning up after the family dinner at your place. Why was he wandering around your house for so long?" I felt a physical blow to my chest as the memory surfaced. I had been in the living room with the kids laughing as Milo showed me his latest drawing. Corbin had volunteered to help clean up something so out of character that I had actually felt proud of him. I was so blind. I had cheered for his helpfulness while he was scouting my medicine cabinet. My memories of that Sunday were rewriting themselves in real time, turning warm smiles into the predatory grins of a wolf. Leonie leaned in closer. "He's been asking about your health insurance, Thane, and your legacy documents. He told me he was just making sure you were taken care of for the long term." We both sat in a stunned, collaborative silence as the pieces of Corbin's scouting mission clicked into place. The attentiveness, the sudden interest in my daily routine, it wasn't love. It was reconnaissance. I reached into the pocket of my tweed jacket, the one I had been wearing on that Sunday when Corbin had helped at my house. My fingers brushed against something small and hard. I pulled it out, expecting a stray button or a coin. Instead, I was holding a small white plastic ring, the safety seal from a new medication bottle. The plastic cap was small, light, but in my hand it felt heavier than a lead casket. "What is this?" I whispered, turning it over in my palm. "I haven't opened a new prescription in months. My current bottle is half empty." Then the realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. Corbin didn't just steal a few of my pills, he replaced my entire bottle. He must have bought a fresh prescription somehow, forging my information, then swapped the tainted bottle into my cabinet that Sunday, while I was distracted with the grandchildren. He discarded the seal in the nearest convenient place, the pocket of my jacket hanging on the mudroom hook. I stared at the tiny white ring in my palm, a discarded piece of trash that shouted the truth. I'd been too trusting to see my son hadn't just made a mistake. He had turned my own home into his staging ground. This wasn't an impulse born of a bad day. This was a meticulously planned execution. He had scouted my house under the guise of family dinners, tracked my medication schedule, bought or created a poison replacement bottle, swapped it into my cabinet while I played with my grandchildren, and then arranged for a professionally made cake to be delivered on my birthday, knowing I would eat it alone, just as his note instructed. I didn't just find a piece of plastic, I found the physical link that bridged the gap between a tragic accident and a calculated murder. Corbin thought he was being clever, hiding his tracks in the pockets of an old man he assumed would be too dead to notice. I looked at Leonie, and I saw the same grim realization mirrored in her blue eyes. We weren't just victims anymore. We were the only ones who knew exactly where the monster was hiding. I gripped that safety seal until the plastic bit into my skin, my grief finally crystallizing into a cold, hard focus. The sound of boots stopped right outside our door. It was time for the truth to come out into the light. The police didn't knock. They moved with the silent, rhythmic efficiency of a machine designed to dismantle a man's life, and I was the one who handed them the first cog. I stood in the sterile, overlit hallway of the UNC Medical Center, my fingers tracing the jagged edge of the plastic safety seal. Every breath felt like inhaling glass. When Detective Ryder Falcon, a compact man in his 50s with eyes that held the weary intelligence of a former Austin PD officer, stepped into the light, I didn't hesitate. I pressed the white ring into his palm. "Detective, I didn't open a new bottle," I said, my voice sounding thin and alien in the vast corridor. This was planted in my house. My jacket was hanging in my mudroom last Sunday when my son came over for dinner. He volunteered to help clean up something he's never done before. Falcon's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Garrison, you're telling me he had unsupervised access to your home, to your medication?" I nodded. He was alone in my hallway for at least 10, maybe 15 minutes. I thought he was using the bathroom. Only my son. I whispered the words tasting like copper and betrayal. The metal of the handcuffs clicked. It was a small sound, but it echoed louder than the hospital's generators. Down in the ER waiting area, the silence was shattered by Corbin's indignant roar. I watched from the glass balcony as two uniformed officers approached him. Corbin Garrison didn't go quietly. His facade crumbled instantly into a defensive, stuttering rage. "You're making a mistake." My father's confused. He's been forgetting things for months. This is his medication. Ask him if he remembers taking it. He screamed, his face turning a mottled, ugly purple. Leonie watched in suspended disbelief, her hands covering her mouth as her husband was led away. Corbin just stopped talking. "Please," she sobbed, but he wouldn't look at her. Instead, his eyes found mine through the glass, burning with a silent, venomous promise of retribution. How do you unlove the man you taught to walk when you realize he's used those steps to hunt you? Detective Falcon guided me away from the railing and toward a quiet administrative office. He didn't offer comfort. He offered the cold, hard clarity of evidence. He sat me down and opened a laptop, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow. "We did a preliminary sweep of his primary device," Thane Ryder said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "It wasn't just a moment of madness. It was a project." He turned the screen toward me, and I felt the air leave my lungs. The search history was a roadmap of premeditation, and every turn led back to my own funeral. The earliest searches dated back 6 months. Lisinopril toxicity in children, how to hide bitter pill taste in frosting. North Carolina, life insurance probate time. Online pharmacy, no prescription verification. Bakery custom cake, Chapel Hill delivery. My son had been researching the chemical composition of my heart medication, finding ways to obtain extra pills, and planning the delivery mechanism while I was teaching Milo how to ride his bike. The detective pointed to searches for elderly cognitive decline, accidental overdose reporting, and father forgets medication dosage symptoms. He'd been building a defense before he even committed the crime, preparing to paint me as a man who couldn't tell the difference between a sugar jar and a pill bottle. I realized then that they were launching the senility defense immediately, and Corbin had been planting seeds for months. Ryder scrolled further down the digital timeline. "There's something else," he said. "He wasn't just planning the poison, he was tracking you." He pulled up a location-sharing log from a family safety app. Corbin had been monitoring my daily patterns for weeks, noting when I was home alone, when I had visitors, and specifically when he came over for that Sunday dinner, logging the exact minutes I was occupied with the grandchildren. The timestamp showed Corbin's phone stationary in the area of my hallway bathroom for exactly 14 minutes, plenty of time to swap the bottles. I looked at the screen, seeing the data points of my own life reduced to a surveillance map. My own son had used a family safety app designed to protect elderly parents to instead hunt me like prey. He had used my love for my grandchildren as the distraction he needed to plant the weapon. I leaned back in the hard plastic chair, feeling old, truly old for the first time in my life. How do you explain to 12 strangers that the boy you taught to ride a bike grew up to measure your life in milligrams? Detective Falcon turned the screen toward me one last time. There's one more thing, Mr. Garrison. He wasn't just waiting for you to die. He was betting on it. I stared at the final document, a digital confirmation of an offshore credit line secured 2 weeks before my birthday. He had used the Garrison name to borrow against the insurance payout. He'd made reservations at a resort in the Cayman Islands for the week after my anticipated funeral. My life wasn't just sold, it was already being spent on a vacation. I gripped the edge of the desk, the cold metal biting into my palms. My son hadn't just calculated my death. He had booked the celebration. Walking into a law office to sue for your own inheritance is one thing. Walking in to ensure your son never breathes free air again is a weight that bends the spine. I moved through the quiet mahogany-paneled corridors of the downtown Chapel Hill firm, with the ghost of Corbin's betrayal trailing behind me like a cold draft. The atmosphere here was a world away from the antiseptic chaos of the hospital or the jagged fluorescent glare of the police station. It was a place of leather-bound books and hushed conversations, a sanctuary of order that I desperately hoped could contain the wildfire my son had started. Benedict Hartwell, a man who looked like he was carved out of old law books, and integrity adjusted his spectacles as he looked across the desk with eyes that had seen too much human greed. He was more than my attorney. He was an old friend who had helped me navigate the probate of my wife's estate, and the look of profound pity he gave me was something I had to reject immediately. Thane, I've heard the rumors from the department. Benedict began, his voice heavy. Please tell me they aren't true. I sat down, feeling every one of my 72 years. The rumors are kind, Benedict. The reality is much worse. I'm not here for a shoulder to cry on. I'm here for a sword. He nodded, the professional mask sliding back into place, though his hand trembled slightly as he opened a thick manila folder. Benedict reveals that he had already made some preliminary inquiries based on the notes Detective Falcon shared. He had found something that Falcon's digital sweep had only hinted at, the concrete motive that had turned my son into a predator. Have you ever seen your own death certificate before you've even had a heart attack? It's written in the ink of an insurance policy. Benedict slid a document across the desk. It was an application for a life insurance policy totaling $1.2 million taken out on me exactly 6 months ago. Corbin had checked the box for the accidental death rider, which would double the payout to nearly $2.5 million if I died of something like, say, an accidental overdose of my own medication. I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was mine, the same elegant, slightly looped G I had used on thousands of high school diplomas over the decades. It was a perfect, chilling forgery. Look at the date, Thane, Benedict said, pointing to the timestamp. He signed this the day you took him to dinner for his promotion. I felt the air leave the room. I remembered that night clearly. I had been so proud of him, so convinced that his success in the hedge fund world was a reflection of the values I had instilled. He had toasted to my health, clinking his glass against mine while planning my autopsy. He used my Mont Blanc, didn't he? I asked, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The one I gave him for his college graduation. Benedict looked down at the report. The ink matches the bottle on your desk, Thane. He wasn't even careful. He was arrogant. The pen felt like a scalpel. Cold, precise, necessary. I realized then that Corbin's plan was deeper than just a single moment of opportunity. Benedict revealed that this was actually Plan B. A month prior, Corbin had attempted to change the beneficiary on my existing retirement accounts, but he had been blocked by a security question. He couldn't answer my mother's middle name. The poison cake hadn't been a sudden impulse. It was a desperate escalation. We spent the next hour drawing the battle lines. This wouldn't just be about the criminal charges Detective Falcon was preparing. We discussed a full-scale legal assault, stripping Corbin of his parental rights to protect Milo and Ren, securing a permanent restraining order, and placing my remaining assets into a protected trust that he could never touch even if he somehow walked free. If we go this route, Thane, there is no going back, Benedict warned, his eyes searching mine. You will be the lead witness in a case that will send your only son to prison for decades. You will have to stand in a courtroom and tell the world that you raised a monster. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the silver pen sitting on his desk. My son died when he put that powder in the frosting, Benedict. I'm protecting what's left. My hand was steady, a strange icy calm settling over me as I signed the retainer. I wasn't just signing a contract, I was hammering the first nail into the coffin of a 40-year lie. As the ink began to dry, Benedict leaned back, but his expression didn't lighten. He mentioned that, since the house mortgage forgery involved interstate wire fraud through the lending firm Corbin used, the FBI was now considering stepping in. This wasn't just a family tragedy anymore. It was becoming a federal nightmare. The scale of Corbin's deception was expanding beyond Chapel Hill, threatening to pull the entire Garrison name into the mud. I didn't care about the reputation anymore. I only cared about the children. If the federal government wanted to help me cage the wolf, I would open the door for them. The ink was still wet on the page when Benedict's desk phone buzzed. He listened for a second, his face turning the color of ash, before looking at me with a look of pure alarm. Thane, Corbin isn't staying quiet. He's just called a press conference from the county jail. My son, the man I had just signed a declaration of war against, was already moving to strike back. He wasn't going to wait for the evidence to bury him. He was going to try and bury the truth first. I stood up the chair, scraping harshly against the floor, knowing that the quiet sanctuary of this office was about to be replaced by the visceral glare of the public eye. I tapped the voice recorder app on my phone, twice tucking it into the breast pocket of my blazer like a concealed weapon before the heavy steel door of the visitation center buzzed open. The sound was an industrial snarl, a jarring reminder that I was no longer in the polite world of high school assemblies and faculty meetings. I was in a place designed to keep monsters in, and I was voluntarily walking into the cage. The air inside the Orange County Jail was thick with the scent of floor wax and stale anxiety, a metallic tang that seemed to coat the back of my throat. I followed the guard to a booth, my heart hammering against the phone in my pocket. I wasn't here to forgive. I wasn't here to weep. I was here to secure the confession that Corbin's public lies had made necessary. When Corbin was led in the sight of him, nearly made me flinch. The tailored Italian suits and the expensive watch were gone, replaced by a shapeless orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow and gray. He sat behind the thick glass barrier, his arrogance curdled into a desperate feral energy. He didn't look at me with regret. He looked at me like a problem he still thought he could solve. He picked up the handset and I did the same, the plastic cold against my ear. "Dad, thank God you came." He began, his voice a frantic whisper through the scratchy intercom. "You have to tell the DA it was a mistake. My lawyer says we can spin it as a medical mix-up. Think of the kid's reputation, Thane. You're destroying the Garrison legacy." I looked at his bitten-down fingernails the way they clawed at the metal table. "I'm not the one who put lisinopril in the lemon frosting, Corbin. You are. Why did you do it? Have you ever sat across from a monster you used to tuck in at night? You look for the boy, but all you see is the scales." I weighted my silence, a principal's tool I had used 1,000 times to make a student crack. Corbin's eyes darted to the guard and then back to me. He leaned in, his breath fogging the glass. "It was a financial necessity, Dad. You don't understand the pressure. My creditors, they were going to take Leonie's house. Your money is just sitting there in a trust-dead money that I won't see for 20 years. I needed that insurance payout now. What were you going to do with it anyway? Sit on it while I lost everything?" His words were like oil on a garage floor, slick, toxic, and impossible to clean up once they touched my soul. I felt a coldness settle over me, an icy clarity that replaced the last flickering ember of my grief. Corbin wasn't done. Believing the room was secure, and that I was still the soft father who would always protect him, he leaned even closer. "I didn't want the kids to get sick, Thane. They were just collateral damage. You were supposed to eat the first slice alone at your house. That was the plan. If you had just done what you were supposed to do, Leonie would have been taken care of. I even had a way to keep her safe afterward." He paused, a dark glint in his eye. "If things had gone sideways, I had enough on her interior design chemical orders to make it look like she was the one who slipped up. I was protecting the family in my own way." I stared at him, realizing the depth of the void where his conscience should have been. "So you traded my life for a gambling debt, and you were ready to frame your wife to cover the spread. And you nearly took your children with me. Blood isn't always thicker than water. Sometimes it's just more expensive." I didn't say another word. I simply stood up and hung the receiver back on its hook. I could see Corbin screaming through the glass, his mouth moving in a silent, ugly rhythm as the guard moved in to lead him away. I walked out of that visitation center, the weight of the phone in my pocket feeling like a trophy. I had it. Every word, every justification, every cold-blooded calculation. I moved through the airlock and out into the sweltering North Carolina sun, the humidity of the parking lot hitting me like a physical wall. I was heading for my truck when I saw a familiar silver sedan parked in the visitor's lot. Gail Stafford, my 68-year-old sister, and a retired librarian who always had a soft spot for my son, sat hunched over her steering wheel. Her face was a mask of tear-streaked regret, her hands knotting a lace handkerchief into a tight ball. "Gail, what are you doing here?" I asked, leaning against her window. She looked up at me, and the guilt in her eyes was so profound it made my stomach turn. She reached into her bag and pulled out a legal envelope, her fingers trembling. "He told me he just wanted to talk to you, Thane. He said he wanted to surprise you for your birthday, and he'd lost his key. I didn't know about the pills. I thought I was helping him make things right between you." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "You gave him the security code, Gail. You let him into my house while I was out." She sobbed a sharp, broken sound that echoed off the surrounding cars. "He's my nephew, Thane. He told me you were being difficult, that you were shutting him out. I even gave him the spare key I've had for months. I thought he was just being a good son." She held out the brass key, the metal glinting in the harsh light. I stood in the sweltering North Carolina sun, staring at my sister as she handed me the tool Corbin had used to invade my sanctuary. The family I had built was collapsing into a heap of secrets and misguided loyalties. "Gail," I whispered, my voice finally breaking. "How many more of you are there?" I took the key, its weight a final crushing burden. The son I raised was a predator, and the sister I trusted was his unwitting scout. I turned and walked toward my truck, leaving her crying in the heat, knowing that the trail of Corbin's destruction was only beginning to be mapped. The echoes of my son's voice on that recording were still rattling around in my skull, each word a jagged nail driven into the coffin of my paternal pride. I sat in the silent, sweltering heat of my truck for a long time, after leaving Gail in that parking lot, staring at the brass key she had placed in my hand. I felt shattered, yes, but beneath the debris of my family life, a cold, clinical anger was beginning to take root. I was no longer just a victim. I was a man armed with the truth, and I knew exactly where I had to go next. I needed to see the numbers. I needed to see the paper trail of the man who had looked at me and seen nothing but a payout. Have you ever seen a man's soul laid bare in the form of a bank statement? I have, and it looked like a trail of scorched earth leading straight to my front door. When I walked into Detective Ryder Falcon's office at the precinct, the smell of toner and high-gloss paper hit me, mixed with the faint, metallic scent of stale coffee. Ryder didn't offer a greeting. He just motioned for me to sit and began spreading a dozen spreadsheets across his desk under the stark neon white light of the overhead fixtures. He looked at me with a weary sort of gravity. "Thane, your son wasn't just playing the market." He began, his voice dropping into a register of professional empathy that made my stomach churn. He was playing a game he could never win with people who don't take apologies for currency. I watched, my breath hitching, as Ryder revealed the financial architecture of Corbin's collapse. His supposed hedge fund was a fiction, a sophisticated Ponzi scheme he'd been running for 3 years. Half of his investors were actually our local Chapel Hill neighbors, people I had known for decades, people who had trusted the Garrison name because they trusted me. The numbers on the page revealed a deficit of nearly $2 million. $2 million. I whispered the word, feeling heavy and foreign. I thought he was a successful manager. I thought he was the one taking care of us. Ryder shook his head. He was taking from everyone to pay back the last person who threatened him. He had a systemic addiction, Thane. Underground, high-stakes poker, offshore betting, the kind of debt that doesn't just go away with a bank loan. I felt a cold sweat prickle my scalp. Every zero on that page felt like a bullet hole in my family's history. I realized that the $2 million insurance policy wasn't even enough to cover the half of it. My son had been drowning, and I was the life raft he planned to scuttle. How much does a father's life cost? According to Corbin's ledger, it was a bargain at one point, $2 million. I stared at the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each second sounding like a hammer. I felt a bitter copper taste of adrenaline in the back of my throat. The betrayal wasn't just in the act of the poisoning, it was in the preparation. He had occupied my most private spaces to engineer my end. Ryder opened another folder containing the 529 college savings plans for my grandchildren Milo and Ren. I had started those accounts the day each of them was born, funneling my principal's salary into their futures. I looked at the most recent balance. It was exactly zero. My heart didn't just break. It felt like it was being hollowed out by a rusted spoon. The final withdrawal, made only 2 weeks before the poisoning, was for $83,000, every penny I'd saved over 10 years. Ryder's voice was clinical as he delivered the blow. That's the exact amount he needed to cover his immediate gambling debts and buy the chemicals. He didn't just steal their education, Ryder. He made them accomplices in their own trauma. Check the dates. Ryder urged, his finger tapping a line on the statement. He drained Milo's account, all $83,000, on the same day he took the boy out for ice cream. He had sat there watching my grandson lick a chocolate cone, knowing he had just stolen the boy's future to buy the tools to kill me. The ink wasn't even dry on the children's betrayal when he was already booking his escape. The short shock of that realization made me lean back, the dry parchment feel of the bank statements suddenly feeling like they were burning my skin. I felt a profound, nauseating, protective rage. Corbin hadn't just been trying to solve a problem, he had been erasing us. He looked at his own children as a collateral, mere line items to be liquidated. Then Ryder slid the final piece of evidence across the desk, a printed confirmation for a one-way flight to the Cayman Islands. It was booked in Corbin's name, only scheduled for the day after the date he had anticipated for my funeral. I looked up at Ryder, my hands trembling as I held the flight confirmation. The bitter taste of adrenaline was now a full-blown roar in my ears. He was going to leave them, I whispered. He wasn't just killing me. He was abandoning Leonie and the kids to face the debt he'd built in my name. He had planned to watch me go into the ground, collect the blood money, and vanish, leaving his wife and children to be torn apart by the neighbors he'd robbed. I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of the conversation ahead made my knees weak. I had to go to Corbin's house. I had to find Leonie, and I had to tell her that the man she loved had already said goodbye to all of us. I didn't expect the crime scene to feel so empty, but as I stepped into my grandson's bedroom, the silence was louder than the sirens that had taken him away. My hands were still vibrating from the meeting, with Ryder Falcon, the flight confirmation to the Cayman Islands, feeling like a brand scorched into my memory. I had driven to Corbin's house under the pretense of gathering clothes and toys for Milo and Ren, but the air inside the affluent Chapel Hill estate felt heavy with the scent of a rotting legacy. I stood in the foyer, my fingers brushing the metallic heavy weight of the spare key in my pocket, the one my own sister had surrendered like a white flag. My son hadn't just intended to kill me. He had planned to vanish into a tropical sunset, leaving Leonie and the children to drown in the wake of his $2 million debt. The house was an eerie monument to a lie. I moved through the kitchen, where the marble countertops gleamed with a cold, mocking perfection. As I made my way toward the back of the house, I began to notice the subtle fractures in Corbin's curated chaos. I found unopened bills hidden under the corner of a decorative Persian rug and a half-packed suitcase shoved into the dark recesses of the master closet, filled with expensive linen shirts he had bought, while his children's college funds were being drained to zero. Everything felt abandoned, yet a thick layer of dust had settled on every surface except for the handle of Corbin's office door. Just a few things to make them feel at home in a hospital bed, I whispered to the shadows, but my voice was swallowed by the stagnant air. The house, once a symbol of my son's supposed triumph over my modest educator's life, was now revealed as a hollowed-out shell, as fake as the forged signature on my insurance policy. $87. That was the price of my son's remaining shred of decency. I entered Milo's room, expecting the soft smell of laundry detergent and the familiar clutter of a 6-year-old's life. Instead, I found a room that had been partially ransacked, as if someone had been searching for a hidden treasure in a frantic, sweaty hurry. My eyes fell to the floor, and my heart suffered a fresh, jagged tear. Milo's hand-painted ceramic piggy bank, the one I had helped him glaze for his 6th birthday, the one he called Commander Coin, was smashed into a dozen sharp pieces on the hardwood. I knelt, the gritty sound of ceramic grinding under my shoe, sounding like bone. I searched through the shards, my fingers tracing the cold, smooth texture of the blue glaze, but the hollow interior was empty. Corbin hadn't just stolen the $2 million. He had crawled into his son's room after the poisoning and stripped away the $87 the boy had been saving for a telescope. I felt my soul shift in that moment, a fundamental realignment of my nature. I reached out and touched a small empty handprint on a dusty shelf where the bank used to sit, the smell of stale apple juice and old toys suddenly making me nauseous. I wasn't just looking at a crime anymore, I was looking at a complete absence of humanity. As I shifted the base of the shelf to gather more shards, a small notebook slid out from a hidden gap in the wood. It was a ledger written in Corbin's cramped, manic hand. The mid-twist hit me with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just been stealing from the kids. He had been using this nursery as a dead drop for cash from his Ponzi scheme, hiding the illegal intake behind his son's stuffed animals. If you're waiting for the moment I stopped being a father and started being a prosecutor, this is it. Right here, on this blue rug. I stood up, my knees cracking, but my resolve was harder than any bone in my body. I realized that a father who can steal from a child he just tried to orphan is a monster that cannot be reasoned with, only caged. The insurance forgery had been about greed, but the smashed remains of a child's hope was about a depravity that defied explanation. "You think you're a burden, Thane?" I asked the empty room, my voice flat and dangerous. "Wait until you see what I become." I wouldn't be the grieving grandfather anymore. I would be the architect of his ending. I began to gather the ceramic shards, but I didn't put them in the trash. I tucked the largest ones into my pocket, the sharp edges biting into my palm. They felt like diamonds in my hand, sharp, hard, and capable of cutting through every lie Corbin had ever told me. I needed them as a physical weight to ground me for the conversation I had to have with Leonie. As I reached for the final piece near the baseboard, I saw a slip of paper that had been pinned beneath the weight of the broken bank. It was a small handwritten note on stationery I recognized immediately. It was from my sister Gail. I pulled the note into the light. It was dated the very morning of the poisoning. "Thane is starting to ask questions about the trust," it read in her elegant librarian script. "Be careful, Corbin. I've done what I can, but he's sharper than you think." The betrayal was a cold liquid fire in my veins. My sister hadn't just given him a key. She had been his lookout, his early warning system. She was more than an unwitting accomplice. She was a sentinel for his greed. I didn't just find a broken toy on that floor. I found the roadmap to my sister's betrayal and my son's complete depravity. And as I tucked Gail's note into my pocket next to the shards of Milo's bank, I knew the family I'd spent 40 years building was officially dead. I stood in the middle of the ransacked nursery, clutching the evidence that would destroy Corbin's defense, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like crying. I felt like a man who finally knew exactly how to fight. Blood may make you related, but it's the loyalty in the dark, the kind that Leonie showed me that rainy Tuesday night that actually makes you family. The sound of rain against the hospital window was a rhythmic, mournful percussion as I waited for her to emerge from the pediatric ICU. I stood there, my pockets weighted down by the ceramic shards of a smashed childhood and the cold, flat evidence of my sister's betrayal. When the automatic doors finally hissed open, Leonie looked like a woman who had been carved out of gray stone. Her eyes were hollow, and the smell of ozone and rain clung to her clothes as we walked out onto the entrance porch. She sank onto a cold, slick hospital bench, watching the neon lights reflecting in the black puddles at her feet. I didn't sugarcoat the truth. I couldn't afford to. I sat beside her and pulled out the empty college fund statements, followed by the note I had found in the ruins of Milo's nursery. "Leonie, he didn't just target me," I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane in my chest. "He used Milo's future to buy the poison. He drained every cent I saved for them." I watched as the last shred of Leonie's hope for Corbin's innocence died in real time. It wasn't a loud death. It was a quiet architectural collapse. She took the note from Gail, her fingers trembling as she recognized the handwriting. My sister had been his sentinel, warning him that I was getting too close to his secrets. Leonie didn't scream. She didn't even sob at first. She just stared at the rain. "I'm not crying for him anymore. Thane," she whispered, her voice a jagged line of resolve. "I'm crying for the woman I was who thought he could be saved. I'm crying for the 10 years I spent sleeping next to a man who was calculating the value of my father-in-law's life in his head while I slept. He wasn't just a husband. He was a parasite. He wasn't just a husband. He was a parasite. That realization was the pivot point. The air around us felt charged, a grim solidarity forming in the space between our grief. Leonie looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a woman who was no longer a victim, but an investigator in her own right. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a stack of documents I hadn't seen before. "I've already contacted a divorce attorney, Thane," she said. "But I want to make one thing clear. I am not leaving you. You are the only father my children have left." She told me she wanted to keep the Garrison name not for Corbin, but for me. She wanted to redefine it as a symbol of the integrity I had shown her, rather than the greed her husband had used to stain it. "I want to keep the name Dad. I want to be the kind of Garrison you are." I felt a surge of deep affection, a protective instinct that transcended biology. "You are my daughter in every way that matters," I replied. We will rebuild everything he burned. I promise you that house will not be taken. The garrison name was a tarnished heirloom, but Leonie and I were going to scrub it until it bled. I pledged my full financial support to her right then and there. I told her about the $2. $4 million in the trust money Corbin had considered his own private bounty. Every cent of it would go towards saving her home and securing the kids' recovery. But then Leonie delivered a twist I hadn't expected. She admitted she had suspected Corbin of an affair for months, watching him sneak out for midnight meetings and whispering into the phone. She had even hired a private investigator of her own, only to realize now that the other woman was actually a series of bookies he was meeting in back alleys. The infidelity wasn't sexual, it was financial. He had been cheating on our entire family with the high-stakes high he could never satisfy. Leonie reached into her bag again and produced a thick legal folder. "I've been keeping these," she said. "I found them hidden in my design studio behind some fabric swatches. They were Corbin's private business receipts, a trail of offshore payments and wire transfers to companies I didn't recognize." She had been building her own case without even knowing the full extent of the crime. But the biggest revelation came as we stood to leave. "Thane, I moved $50,000 of my own design business earnings into a secret account months ago," she confessed. "I didn't know he was a murderer, but I knew he was unstable. I knew the floor was going to fall out eventually. I just didn't know he was going to push you through it first." I looked at her with new respect. We had the immediate capital to start the legal war. We weren't starting from zero. Who says you can't choose your family? I was looking at mine and she was holding a divorce petition like a shield. We stood together at the entrance of the hospital, the muffled sound of a distant ambulance siren punctuating the silence of our pact. The sharp crinkle of the divorce papers in her hand was the sound of a noose being tightened not on us, but on Corbin. We walked toward the hospital's security office to meet Detective Ryder, our footfalls synchronized on the linoleum. "Are you ready to see this through?" "All the way to the end?" I asked as we reached the heavy steel door. Leonie didn't hesitate. Her face was illuminated by the blinding white glare of the security office lights, making her look like a warrior. "I was ready the moment he touched my children's cake," she said. As we stepped back into the sterile light of the hospital, Leonie squeezed my hand so hard her knuckles turned white. It was a silent promise, a chosen family making a blood oath without the need for a single drop of it. "He thinks he's left us with nothing. Dad," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty hall. "He has no idea what happens when you corner an interior designer and a school principal." I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. We weren't just witnesses anymore. We were the executioners of his legacy. I watched the sunrise over Chapel Hill, but the light didn't bring warmth. It only illuminated the wreckage of the life my son had systematically dismantled while I was busy believing his lies. As Leonie and I walked toward the law office of Benedict Hartwell, I could feel the ghost of Corbin's betrayal trailing us like a cold draft. Leonie squeezed my hand so hard her knuckles turned white, a silent echo of her words back at the hospital. "He thinks he's left us with nothing, but he has no idea what he's sparked." We weren't just a grandfather and a daughter-in-law anymore. We were a tactical unit. The morning sun hit Benedict's mahogany desk as he began laying out a series of legal documents with a funereal slowness. The room smelled of toner and high-gloss paper, a scent that had become synonymous with the death of my family. Benedict looked at us with a grim line for a mouth holding a paper that felt heavier than its physical weight. "Thane Leonie. I wish I had better news," he began. This was delivered to the house while Corbin was being processed. "It's a notice of default." My heart gave a sickening thud. Benedict explained that 8 months ago, Corbin had taken out a second mortgage on their home for $150,000. He had forged Leonie's signature with a chilling surgical precision. The lender wasn't a bank. It was a high-interest predatory firm called Apex Equity, and they had already initiated foreclosure proceedings. "Leonie, did you ever sign a notary document in October?" Benedict asked. She looked at the paper, her eyes widening as the rhythmic tapping of her heel on the hardwood floor suddenly stopped. "October. I was in High Point for the furniture market that entire week. I wasn't even in the county," she whispered, her voice trembling with a new kind of administrative dread. "How do you quantify the value of a home when the person who built it with you is the one holding the match?" I felt a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. The coffee I'd swallowed earlier turning to acid. Benedict slid the notary page toward me, and I felt the air leave my lungs. There, stamped in the corner, was a familiar purple seal. The notary who had authorized the forgery was Gail Stafford, my sister, My own flesh and blood hadn't just given Corbin a key to my house. She had used her legal commission to help him steal his wife's roof. I stared at that purple mark until it blurred into a bruise. Gail notarized this. My own sister helped him steal your home. I asked the words feeling like shards of glass. She didn't just help him, Thane. She sanctioned it. Leonie replied, her shock hardening into a focused architectural rage. She was looking at the woman who had sat at our Thanksgiving table, while simultaneously signing away the ceiling over her grandchildren's beds. I felt a short shock of nausea. Gail's seal was purple, a royal color for a peasant's betrayal. Benedict adjusted his spectacles, his fingers tracing the fine print of the contract. It gets worse, he said. Thane, I did a background check on the notary logs. Gail's commission had actually expired 2 days before she signed these documents. He thought he was being clever, but his incompetence might be our only leverage. However, while it makes the mortgage technically fraudulent, it's a legal nightmare to untangle. Apex Equity doesn't care about family drama. They want their money or the dirt. Benedict revealed the predatory reality of the loan, a 24% interest rate with a massive balloon payment due in exactly 30 days. It was an amount Leonie could never afford, not with the kids' college funds drained to zero. I looked at the ticking wall clock each second, sounding like a hammer striking a nail. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Corbin never expected to pay this back. He gambled the house on my deathbed, didn't he? I asked. Benedict nodded slowly. He bet everything on a funeral that never happened, Thane. He assumed the insurance payout from your accidental death would settle the debt and leave him with a clean slate in the Caymans. I looked at Leonie, and I saw the urgent protective panic in her eyes. She wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about where Milo and Ren would sleep when they finally left the hospital. The interest rate wasn't a number. It was a noose tightening around Leonie's neck with every tick of the clock. We weren't just fighting a criminal case for the poisoning anymore. We were in a race to stop the bank from throwing a broken family into the street. Benedict turned to the final page of the disclosure, and his jaw tightened so hard I heard the bone click. The exit twist was the final insult. Thane. I've tracked the ownership of Apex Equity. It's a shell company. It's owned by a holding group tied to the same offshore bookies Corbin owed money to. The loan wasn't just a loan. The house was being used as direct collateral for his gambling debts. He didn't just borrow money. He handed the keys of his children's lives to the sharks. I stood up, the dry, parchment-like feel of the foreclosure notice still lingering on my fingertips. The scale of the depravity was so vast, it felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. Benedict looked up from the final page, his face ash gray. There's a rider on this contract, Leonie. If the house goes to auction, the children's names are listed as secondary debtors. He didn't just steal their home. He stole their credit scores before they even reached high school. He had mortgaged their entire future to pay for his past. I looked at Leonie, and the fire in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. I was going to my sister's house. I was going to find out how much of her soul she had sold to help my son burn our world down. I didn't knock on my sister's door. I hammered on it with the rhythm of a man who had just realized his family's history was written in invisible ink and forged signatures. The heavy official documents from Benedict's office sat on my passenger seat like a live grenade, and my blood felt like liquid fire as I stood on Gail's porch in Cedar Park. I had spent 72 years believing that blood was the ultimate contract, an unbreakable bond that transcended greed. But as the door finally creaked open, revealing Gail in her floral housecoat, the smell of lavender and stale cigarettes wafting from the hallway, I knew that contract had been shredded months ago. I pushed past her without waiting for an invitation. I went straight to the living room and dropped the predatory mortgage papers onto her lace-covered coffee table. The sharp crinkle of the legal documents seemed to echo in the small, cluttered room. "You notarized a theft, Gail," I said, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous register I had only used for the most severe disciplinary hearings. "You put your name and your official seal on a document that steals the roof from Milo and Ren's heads." Gail flinched, her hands beginning to tremble as she reached for a handkerchief. She tried to play the victim immediately, her eyes welling with well-practiced tears. "Thane, please. He told me it was just a restructuring plan. He said it was for their inheritance, that you were having trouble managing accounts, and he was just helping you keep the house in the family. At what point does family loyalty become a suicide pact? I think Gail reached that point a long time ago." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see my younger sister. I saw a co-conspirator who had traded the safety of her grandchildren for the comfort of a lie. "You didn't read the papers. Gail, You didn't see the 24% interest rate or the balloon payment that Leonie could never afford. Or did you just not care? Because Corbin promised you a seat at the table when I was gone. She sank into her armchair, the sight of her trembling hands no longer eliciting pity, only cold, hard disgust. I pushed further, knowing the mortgage was only the beginning. I know about the $5,000, Gail, I said, leaning over the table. I know about the wire transfer you made to the Martinez sister. Gail's face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. She wasn't crying because she was sorry. She was crying because she was caught. She admitted it, then her voice a pathetic whisper. Corbin said, "You were confused, Thane. He said Leonie was poisoning your mind against him trying to take the Garrison legacy. And he told me the only way to save the family reputation was to buy a witness who could tell the truth about her instability." My stomach turned. $5,000 to buy a lie. Gail, is that what our father taught you? You weren't just a passive enabler. You were an active financier of his madness. Then came the twist that made me feel like I was walking through a nightmare. As she sobbed, she confessed that Corbin hadn't just used his charm. He had promised her a pension, a fixed monthly sum from the life insurance payout I wasn't supposed to survive. Her motivation wasn't just some misguided sense of loyalty. It was raw, unadulterated greed. She had literally bet on my death to fund her retirement. I stood up the space in the room, suddenly feeling too small, the air too thick with the scent of her betrayal. I informed her then, with a surgical finality, that I was handing every scrap of evidence, the expired notary seal, the bank records of her wire transfer, and the note I'd found in the nursery to Benedict and the district attorney. "Thane, you can't!" she shrieked, reaching out to grab my arm. "I'm your sister. If you do this, they'll strip my commission, maybe even send me to jail." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve and pulled away. "If you're lucky, that's all they'll do. Gail, if you're not, you'll be sharing a cell block with the nephew you helped turn into a murderer." I realized that loving my sister didn't mean protecting her from the consequences of her crimes. It meant holding her accountable so the rot would stop spreading. As I turned to leave, she threw one final desperate barb. "You're choosing her. You're choosing an outsider over your own blood." I stopped at the door, the metallic weight of it in my hand. "Leonie isn't the outsider, Gail. She's the one who stayed when the person with my blood tried to kill me. You're the one who left." I walked out the front door, closing with a final thud that felt like a period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. The Garrison name wasn't a shield anymore. It was a brand, and my sister had used it to burn everything I loved. I walked down the driveway, the muffled sound of a neighbor's lawnmower, providing a mundane backdrop to the collapse of my personal world. As I reached my truck, I glanced at the mail pile Gail had left on the porch table. On top was a letter from a private investigator. I didn't even have to open it. The return address was the same firm Corbin had mentioned. My own sister had been digging up dirt on my medical history, looking for any shred of evidence of cognitive decline to use in the trial. She had been sharpening the knife while Corbin was aiming for the heart. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned as white as the forged documents on the seat. The betrayal was complete. There was no more family tree, only a series of stumps. I looked at the ranch house in the rearview mirror as I backed out. "Goodbye, Gail," I whispered, knowing that the next time I saw her, she'd be wearing the same handcuffs as my son. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the city, my mind already shifting to the courtroom. I was done being a victim. I was going to be the witness that finally finished what Corbin started. I watched the local news truck pull up to the curb outside my law office, its satellite dish unfolding, like the wing of a predatory bird ready to feed on my family's corpse. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and expensive perfume, a cloying mixture that made my stomach churn as I stood by the window of Benedict Hartwell's downtown suite. For months we had been preparing for this day in the shadows, but now the lights were being turned on, and I wasn't sure the world was ready for the ugliness they would reveal. Benedict stood behind me, his reflection in the glass, a mirror of my own exhaustion. We had finalized the strategy, but as he pointed out, Corbin's defense had already won their first tactical victory. They had successfully lobbied the judge to keep the smash piggy bank out of evidence, arguing it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the murder charge. It was a blow to the heart of our narrative, the proof that my son's depravity knew no bounds, but we had to move forward with what remained. "They're going to call you principal punishment." Thane Benedict warned, his voice low and steady. "They've been leaking stories to the tabloids for weeks. They'll say you were always too hard on him, that your rigidity drove him to the brink, and that now you're projecting your own failures onto a successful man. I turned away from the window, looking at the stacks of subpoenas and forensic reports that cluttered the mahogany desk. Let them, I replied, feeling a cold pragmatic stoicism settle into my bones. A hard truth is better than a comfortable lie. I spent 30 years disciplining other people's children for taking shortcuts. I won't let my own son take the ultimate shortcut and walk away from what he did to Milo and Ren. Have you ever been the lead story on the 6 o'clock news? It's like watching a stranger wear your skin while they tell lies about your soul. Later that afternoon, a local news expose titled "The Garrison Poisoning" aired, and I was forced to watch my son's face, the one I had held in my hands when he was an infant, frozen in a grainy jailhouse mugshot. The narrative in Chapel Hill had split like a lightning-struck oak. I walked into the grocery store for a gallon of milk and felt the burning stares of former colleagues. People I had served with on the school board for decades suddenly found the labels of cereal boxes fascinating when I passed. The digital backlash was worse. Gail's rumors of my supposed senility had taken root in the dark corners of social media, fueling a Justice for Corbyn campaign that painted me as a vengeful patriarch. I was experiencing my first taste of true public isolation, a social freezing that made the North Carolina summer feel like midwinter. "Mr. Garrison, is it true you're testifying against your only child?" a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward my face as I exited the market. I stopped looking directly into the lens of the camera. "I'm testifying for my grandchildren." "There's a difference," I said, my voice carrying the same weight of authority I used to command in a crowded gymnasium. I realized then that resilience wasn't just about surviving the poison. It was about surviving the people who wanted to pretend the poison didn't exist. The flashbulbs weren't lights. They were lightning strikes, and I was the tallest tree in the forest. September arrived with a crispness that felt like a threat. The morning of the trial, I stood at the base of the Orange County Courthouse steps flanked by Leonie and Benedict. A gauntlet of reporters and flashing cameras blocked our path, creating a sensory storm that made my head spin. I scanned the crowd and spotted Gail standing near the back with Corbyn's defense team. Her face was cold, distant, and devoid of the remorse I had hoped to see. She was choosing her side, and it wasn't mine. I realized the trial wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was the final battleground for the Garrison name. "Keep your eyes on the doors, Leonie," I whispered, shielding her from a particularly aggressive cameraman. "Don't look at the flashes." "I'm not looking at the cameras, Dad," she replied, her jaw set in a hard line. "I'm looking at Gail. I want her to see exactly what she's helping to destroy." The courthouse doors didn't look like justice. They looked like the mouth of a cave where I'd have to kill the dragon I'd raised. As we entered the building, the air turned dry and cold, smelling of old wood and floor wax. We moved through the metal detectors and into the hushed, vaulted hallways where the business of human misery was conducted every day. Benedict led us into the courtroom, and the exit twist hit me with the force of a physical blow. Corbyn's defense had seated a row of loyal family friends right behind the defense table. Men and women I had known for 30 years, people who had been at my wife's funeral and Corbyn's graduation. They sat there like a wall of betrayal, their faces turned away from me, providing a visual shield of respectability for the man in the polished suit. I looked at Corbyn. He had a new professional haircut, and his suit was tailored to make him look like the victim of a tragic misunderstanding rather than a predator. The murmuring gallery fell silent as the bailiff's voice cut through the room like a whip. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison." As I stood, my knees aching but my back straight, I locked eyes with Corbyn across the aisle. For the first time since his arrest, he didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, looked me in the eye, and he smiled. It was a cold, triumphant expression that said he still believed he could win this game. I gripped the edge of the wooden bench, the dry air of the courtroom filling my lungs as the judge's gavel hit the block with a heavy, rhythmic thud that sounded like the first strike of an execution. The game was over. The truth was about to begin. There is no sound quite like the rhythmic thump of a judge's gavel. It is the heartbeat of justice. And in that crowded Chapel Hill courtroom in September 2021, it sounded like a drumbeat leading me to my son's execution. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood floor wax and the collective breath of a community that had come to watch a family dismantle itself in public. I sat at the prosecution table, my back straight, refusing to look at the gallery where so many former friends now sat as silent judges of my character. I could feel their eyes boring into the back of my head, could hear the whispered speculation that would follow me for the rest of my days. Corbyn sat across the aisle looking like the pinnacle of success in a charcoal suit, that probably cost more than my monthly pension, his posture radiating a cold, calculating defiance. His hair was perfectly styled, his expression one of wounded innocence, and if I hadn't known better, I might have believed he was the victim here. When the judge signaled for the start of the proceedings, the room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the dry, papery crinkle of the court documents in the hands of the bailiff, the subtle shift of fabric as people leaned forward in anticipation. Delphine Crawford, the lead prosecutor for Orange County, with a voice like polished marble and an efficiency that made even the judge look slow, stood and adjusted her spectacles. She was a woman in her 50s who had built her career on complex financial crimes, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case she believed in. She didn't waste time with flowery rhetoric. Her opening salvo was a clinical and devastating autopsy of Corbin's intent. This wasn't a crime of passion, ladies and gentlemen. She began, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. It was a crime of accounting. He didn't just bake a cake, he mixed a death warrant. The metaphor was brutal and effective, and I saw several jurors flinch. She detailed the timeline of the lisinopril poisoning with the precision of a surgeon, painting Corbin not as a victim of debt, but as a predator who viewed his own father as a walking ATM. The jury watched her, captivated by the cold logic of her words. She revealed a detail that even I hadn't fully processed. Corbin had actually attempted to cancel the children's health insurance policy the day before the poisoning, on March 15th, 2021. He intended to leave Leonie with absolutely zero resources for their recovery, while he vanished with the insurance payout from my death. The insurance company had flagged the cancellation request as suspicious and delayed it. An administrative quirk that may have saved Milo and Ren's lives by ensuring they had coverage when they arrived at the ER. He didn't just want me dead, he wanted me broke and forgotten. I felt the metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth as Crawford spoke, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. I looked at Corbin expecting to see a flicker of shame, but he only straightened his tie and offered a faint, mocking smile to a woman in the third row, one of the loyal friends his defense had planted in the gallery. It was as if he were watching a play rather than a trial for his own life. The callousness of it was a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes that I had to fight to keep contained. I had raised this man. I had taught him about the value of integrity and the importance of family, sitting at the dinner table night after night, discussing ethics and responsibility. I had held him when he cried, as a child celebrated his victories, consoled him through his failures. And yet here he was, treating the near death of his own children as a minor inconvenience in his pursuit of profit. Dr. Sarah Kim was the next to take the stand. She presented a digital recreation of the cake's chemical composition on a large monitor that had been wheeled into the courtroom. The clinical blue glow of the screen illuminated the dark wood of the courtroom as she explained the findings with the detached professionalism of someone who had testified in dozens of cases. The lisinopril wasn't just in the frosting, she explained, her voice steady and professional. It was concentrated with surgical precision in the center slices, the ones typically reserved for the guest of honor. She used a pointer to indicate the cross-section diagram, showing how the medication had been crushed and mixed specifically into the middle layers of the cake, where the birthday celebrant would traditionally take the first piece. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the jury box as they realized the poison was precision, placed to ensure I was the one who died, even if the children shared the meal. It was a scientific horror story told in milligrams and percentages. Doctor Kim explained that the concentration found in those center slices would have been lethal to an adult, while the trace amounts in the outer slices, what Milo and Ren had eaten, were enough to cause severe bradycardia, but not immediate death. How do you explain to 12 strangers that the boy you taught to ride a bike grew up to measure your life in milligrams? I looked at the jury, searching for a sign of their thoughts, but their faces were masks of professional neutrality, the deliberate blankness of people who knew they were being watched. His heart shattered. Rage boiled inside him. The witness stand didn't feel like wood. It felt like a pedestal in a museum of my own failures. When the bailiff finally called my name, my legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk with the same measured authority I had used for decades as a principal addressing an assembly. As I passed the defense table, I noticed Corbin's attorney holding a photo. It was a picture of me from 5 years ago, taken during a bout of heavy flu. I looked frail, confused, and old. I realized then that they were launching the senility defense, immediately preparing to paint me as a man who couldn't tell the difference between a sugar jar and a pill bottle. The strategy was clear: if they couldn't deny the poisoning, they would try to shift the blame to the victim's supposed incompetence. I took the oath, the cold metal of the microphone biting into my fingertips as I adjusted it, my reflection visible in its polished surface. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked, his voice formal and practiced. "I do. For my grandchildren I do," I replied, my voice echoing with a resolve that surprised even me. The addition wasn't part of the standard oath, but no one objected. Crawford stepped toward me, her eyes locking onto mine, with an intensity that demanded honesty. "Mr. Garrison?" She began, her tone softening just enough to invite the jury into our confidence, to make them feel like they were hearing a private conversation rather than a formal interrogation. "Can you tell the jury exactly what your son said to you when he realized you were still alive?" I looked at Corbin. The mocking smile was still there, a challenge etched into the corners of his mouth. He thought I would break. He thought the shame of our shared blood would keep me silent. He thought that even now, even after everything, I would choose the lie of family unity over the truth of his monstrosity. The silence in the room was a living thing, a hungry beast waiting for my answer. I took a breath, the air tasting of dust and finality. He called me a burden. I said the words falling like stones into a still pond, sending ripples through the courtroom. He said I was sitting on dead money while his life was falling apart. He told me I was supposed to be the only one who ate that cake. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. He said that if I had just followed his instructions, if I had eaten the cake alone, like he told me to, then everything would have been fine. His children would be safe, his wife would be taken care of, and I would just be gone. A problem solved, a debt cleared. As I spoke, I could see the jurors leaning in their skepticism, beginning to erode under the weight of my steady gaze. I wasn't the confused old man the defense wanted them to see. I was a father who had finally stopped protecting a monster. Crawford nodded, her expression grim but satisfied. "And what did you do then, Mr. Garrison?" I reached into my pocket and felt the phantom weight of that safety seal, the small piece of plastic that had started this entire avalanche of truth. "I started recording," I said. "And now, the whole world is going to hear exactly who my son really is." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge's gavel came down with that rhythmic thump that had become the soundtrack of my nightmare. "Order," the judge commanded, but I could see it in her eyes. The case had just shifted irrevocably in our favor. I pressed play on my phone, and the silence of the courtroom was instantly violated by my son's voice, cold and metallic, calling me a burden that needed to be cleared from his ledger. The sound didn't just fill the room. It seemed to physically push against the walls, vibrating through the wooden benches and into the very marrow of my bones. I stood in the witness box, my hand still hovering over the device, watching the jury. Their faces, which had been masks of professional skepticism during the defense's opening, began to harden like cooling concrete. This wasn't a transcript or a second-hand account. This was Corbin in his own arrogant cadence, admitting that the poisoning was a calculated move to secure his lifestyle. The audio quality was crystal clear. The prison phone system had captured every nuance, every breath, every moment of his cold calculation as he explained to me why my life was worth less than his debts. The courtroom speakers broadcast every syllable of his jailhouse admission with agonizing clarity. "I needed that money now, Dad. Not when you're 90. The recording hissed, Corbin's voice carrying that particular tone of entitled frustration I had heard so many times when he didn't get his way as a child. "Your money is just sitting there in a trust, dead money that I won't see for 20 years. What were you going to do with it anyway? Sit on it while I lost everything." The jurors leaned forward as one, a collective movement of revulsion. I could see their reactions. The middle-aged woman in the front row, whose hand flew to her mouth, the older gentleman, whose jaw clenched tight. The young man who shook his head slowly as if trying to deny what he was hearing. I looked at Corbin, and for the first time his mocking smirk finally faltered. He slumped slightly, the charcoal suit that had looked like armor an hour ago, now appearing too large for him, as if he were shrinking under the weight of his own words. Delphine Crawford let the silence hang for a long moment after the recording ended, allowing the weight of my son's words to settle over the gallery like a toxic fog. "Let the record show the defendant identified his motive in his own words," she said, her voice a sharp contrast to the recording's jagged desperation. The emotional weight of the admission left even the bailiff looking away, unable to meet the eyes of a father whose son had just quantified his life as a debt to be settled. Family. It's a word that can be a sanctuary or a cage. I felt the truth of that as I stepped down from the stand, my legs heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had finally stopped carrying a secret. The walk from the witness box to my seat felt like miles each step echoing in the hushed courtroom. Leonie Garrison took my place next, and she looked like a woman carved out of integrity. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she detailed the financial wreckage Corbin had hidden behind his designer watches and offshore accounts. She spoke of the forged mortgage and the systematic theft from Milo and Wren's college funds with a clinical precision that left no room for the defense to maneuver. She had brought documentation, bank statements, forged signatures, timelines that showed exactly when Corbin had drained each account. She dismantled their happy family narrative, describing the double life Corbin lived, while she was busy designing homes for families that weren't built on lies. She spoke of coming home to find him on whispered phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, of unexplained absences that he attributed to work functions she was never invited to attend. He didn't just steal a house. He stole his children's sense of safety. Leonie testified, her eyes flicking once to Corbin with a look of profound, exhausted pity. "Was there ever a time you doubted your husband's business success, Mrs. Garrison?" the defense attorney asked, standing up in what was clearly a desperate attempt to shift blame, trying to imply she was complicit in the lifestyle, or at least willfully ignorant of where the money was coming from. Leonie didn't blink. "I doubted his soul, not his spreadsheets. I just didn't realize the two were so closely linked." The courtroom erupted in a low murmur at that, and even the judge seemed to suppress a reaction. During her testimony, she revealed a detail that made me grip the railing. Corbin had pawned her grandmother's engagement ring, the one thing he knew she cherished above all else. A family heirloom that had survived 3 generations to pay for a single weekend's debt at a private poker game in Charlotte. The betrayal was layer upon layer, a nesting doll of greed that seemed to have no end. She produced the pawnshop receipt dated just 2 weeks before the poisoning in March 2021, the item description reading 1940s platinum ring, 2-carat diamond, valued at $2,500. How much does a soul cost in Chapel Hill? Apparently about $5,000 and a used notary seal. Before I expose the truth behind that $5,000 wire transfer, I want to know if you're still watching this with me. Comment A if you think she should be forgiven for family loyalty, or BO if you think she belongs in a cell, and add one short reason so I can see your side. Please note the next part contains recreated details added for narrative impact to convey the core message. If you're not comfortable with dramatized elements, this is a good place to exit. The climactic moment arrived when Detective Ryder Falcon was called to present the evidence of the $5,000 wire transfer Gail Stafford had made to Jessica Martinez, a woman who had claimed during earlier testimony to have witnessed Leonie acting erratically around my medication cabinet, a complete fabrication. Gail was called back to the stand, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of panic. She wore the same floral dress she had worn to my wife's funeral years ago, and the sight of it made my stomach turn. She tried to maintain the lie, claiming she only wanted to help her nephew because he's family, her voice trembling but defiant. But Falcon's documentation was an executioner's blade. He presented bank records showing the wire transfer time-stamped 3 days before Martinez's testimony. He presented text messages between Gail and Corbin, discussing making sure the story is airtight, and the old woman will say whatever we need her to say. Did you or did you not receive $5,000 from Gail Stafford 3 days before you testified? Crawford asked Martinez, who had been brought back into the courtroom under subpoena. The woman's face crumbled, and she admitted through sobs that yes, she had been paid, that she had never actually seen Leonie near my house, that Corbin had coached her on exactly what to say. Gail sat in the gallery, her hands knotting a handkerchief into a white-knuckled ball, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or might have been curses. The judge didn't wait for Gail to find another excuse. He struck Martinez's previous testimony from the record entirely and ordered an investigation into witness tampering. Gail's departure wasn't an exit. It was a slow-motion car crash that took the last of the Garrison dignity with it. As court officers moved in to escort her out for her role in the witness tampering, she finally snapped. The composed librarian demeanor that had defined her for 68 years shattered like glass. She turned toward the defense table, her voice a shrill scream that cut through the judicial decorum like a knife through silk. "You promised me the car's Corbin," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my son, with all the fury of a woman who had bet everything on the wrong horse. "You said I'd get Thane's vintage collection as a bonus for keeping the story straight. You said he was already as good as dead. The revelation that my own sister had appraised my belongings while I was still fighting for breath made the room spin. I had a small collection of classic cars in a storage unit, a 1967 Mustang, a 1972 Corvette, nothing extravagant, but vehicles I had lovingly restored over decades. The thought that she had been mentally dividing my possessions while I lay in a hospital bed, watching my grandchildren fight for their lives, was a betrayal that cut deeper than Corbin's poison ever could. Her greed wasn't just a byproduct, it was the fuel for her loyalty. She hadn't been manipulated by Corbin. She had been a willing partner motivated by the promise of vintage chrome and leather seats. The metallic smell of the microphone stand seemed to fill my senses as I watched her being led out in disgrace, her screams echoing down the corridor, even after the doors closed behind her. Corbin's defense was an absolute irreparable shambles. His attorney sat with his head in his hands, probably already calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this case. The jury box was a tableau of disgust, 12 faces that had moved from skepticism to certainty, from professional detachment to personal revulsion. As the doors swung shut behind my sister, I looked at Corbin. The mocking smile was gone, replaced by the pale, sweating face of a man who realized the high-stakes game he was playing had finally turned against him. He looked small-cornered and, for the first time in 45 years, truly exposed. The expensive haircut, the tailored suit, the practiced expressions of innocence, all of it had been stripped away to reveal the desperate, greedy man beneath. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and cold, as the grave he had tried to dig for me. I could almost hear the sound of his defense crumbling brick by brick until there was nothing left, but the truth my son had tried to kill me for money, and his own aunt had helped him do it. Waiting for a jury to decide if your only son is a murderer feels like sitting in an airtight room where the oxygen is slowly being replaced by the weight of every mistake you ever made as a father. As the doors swung shut behind my sister, I looked at Corbin. The mocking smile was gone, replaced by the pale, sweating face of a man who realized the high-stakes game he was playing had finally turned against him. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and I watched a bead of sweat trace a path down his temple. I followed Leonie out into the hallway, leaving the clinical theater of the courtroom behind. We found a hard wooden bench, our bodies sinking into the grain, as if we were becoming part of the courthouse architecture itself. The smell of floor wax and nervous sweat hung heavy in the air, a scent I knew I would associate with the death of my family for the rest of my days. Leonie's hand was a cold, hard pressure in mine, a silent anchor in the storm of our anxiety. We didn't talk about the evidence anymore. We talked about the children. We spoke of Milo's slow progress with his speech and Wren's resilience building the foundation of the new Garrison family we had forged in the fire of Corbin's betrayal. "Do you think they saw it, Thane?" She whispered, her eyes tracking a fly against the high windows. The way he didn't even look at the photos of the kids in the emergency room. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors that separated us from 12 strangers holding our future in their hands. Juries see more than we give them credit for, Leonie. They saw a predator, not a father. At the end of the corridor, media vultures hovered, their lenses glinting like the eyes of jackals waiting for a carcass. I closed my eyes, and the 8-hour wait became a mental montage of my entire life with Corbin. The first steps he took in our backyard in 1976, the graduations where I had stood applauding in the crowd, the pride I'd felt that now felt like a cruel joke played by a universe with a twisted sense of humor. The courthouse clock didn't tick. It hammered each second a strike against the anvil of my patience. My chest felt tight, the rhythmic thumping of my heart echoing the passage of time. I had spent 45 years trying to build a man, only to spend the last 6 months trying to stop him. The irony was a bitter pill that wouldn't go down. I looked at Leonie, her face etched with a fatigue that no amount of sleep would ever fix. We were survivors, but the cost of our survival was written in every gray hair on my head and every tear she had shed for a man who never deserved them. Around us, other families waited for their own verdicts. A drunk driving case, a domestic assault, a theft, and I wondered if they felt the same suffocating weight of time stretching like taffy. Just before the light began to fade in the hallway, Benedict emerged from a side room, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes carrying a glint of something that looked like vindication. He leaned in, his voice a low vibration that only we could hear. "Thane, I just got word." One of those loyal friends Corbin had planted in the gallery. He wasn't a friend. He was an undercover investigator for the bank Corbin defrauded. They have already used the testimony from today to freeze every hidden asset Corbin had left. He's going into that courtroom with nothing but the clothes on his back. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction wash over me. The walls weren't just closing in, they were already touching. Corbin's escape plan, his offshore accounts, his carefully constructed financial fortress, all of it was crumbling in real time, and he didn't even know it yet. The buzzer sounded a sharp electric rasp that made Leonie jump and clutch my arm harder. It was the signal. A verdict had been reached. My legs felt like lead as we stood walking back into the arena where the final act of this tragedy would play out. I watched the 12 jurors file back in their faces unreadable masks that gave nothing away. I searched for a sign, a look of pity for me, a hard-eyed stare for the man across the aisle. Some looked tired, others resolute, but none would meet my eyes. Corbin stood straightening his suit one last time, with trembling hands, but the arrogance had been replaced by a frantic, vibrating energy that reminded me of a trapped animal sensing the end. He looked toward the judge as if searching for a loophole in the fabric of reality, some last-minute miracle that would whisk him away from the consequences of his choices. The sight of the dust motes dancing in the final sunset light through the courtroom windows gave the room a surreal golden glow, as if we were all frozen in amber, a moment preserved forever in the collective memory of everyone present. Guilty, a 6-letter word that weighed 1,000 tons. The judge, a woman who had presided with stern efficiency throughout the trial, looked at the foreperson, a man in his 50s who looked remarkably like a younger version of myself. Same build. Same serious expression, same weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. We have your honor, the foreperson replied, his voice trembling slightly under the weight of the moment. I held my breath, the silence in the room so absolute I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the rustle of paper as the court reporter positioned her hands. On the count of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of child endangerment, guilty. On the count of insurance fraud, guilty. On the count of forgery, guilty. Each word fell like a hammer blow, and with each one, I felt a piece of the weight I'd been carrying lift from my shoulders. Leonie collapsed into my arms, a sharp broken sob escaping her as she buried her face in my shoulder. It was a mix of grief for the life she lost and a profound relief for the safety of her children. Her entire body shook with the force of emotions she'd been holding back for months. Anger, fear, loss, vindication, all pouring out in a single moment of release. I kept my eyes open watching Corbin. He didn't scream. He let out a low animalistic groan of defeat, his shoulders slumping as if the very air had been sucked out of him. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, probably offering some hollow words of comfort about appeals and second chances. But Corbin's face told the story of a man who knew the game was over. The bailiffs moved in with practiced efficiency, the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs, sounding like a period at the end of a very long, dark sentence. Corbin looked at the jury, and I saw the moment he realized his defense had failed to vet the foreperson, a man whose own mother had been a victim of a financial scam years earlier. A detail that had somehow slipped through the cracks of jury selection. The connection was a final poetic blow from a universe that had tired of his games. Is it possible to feel your soul getting lighter while your heart breaks into a million pieces? I suppose it is. I watched as they turned him toward the side door that led to the holding cells. You're dead to me, Corbin hissed as they pulled him away, his eyes locking onto mine with a final desperate venom that should have hurt, but somehow didn't. I didn't flinch. I just watched him go, finally at peace with the man I had to become to stop him. The Garrison name no longer belonged to his greed. It belonged to our survival. I felt Leonie's grip on my arm tighten, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could take a full breath without the weight of impending doom pressing on my chest. I watched the heavy oak doors swing shut behind my son for the last time. As a free man, the sound echoing through the emptying courtroom, like the closing of a book. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a man who had finally cut out a cancer, knowing the surgery had saved the body, but left a scar that would never stop itching. The courtroom began to clear, families shuffling out with their own verdicts and their own burdens. The shadows stretched long across the floor as the sun dipped lower, and I knew that while this chapter was over, the long road of healing was only just beginning. Benedict approached us, his hand extended. You did the right thing, Thane, he said simply. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but you saved lives today. Not just Milo and Ren's every senior citizen who would have been Corbin's next target. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. As we walked out of the courthouse, past the media circus that shouted questions we didn't answer, I felt Leonie's hand slip into mine. We had survived. Corbin had tried to poison us, to steal from us, to destroy us from the inside out. And we had survived. The evening air hit my face cool and clean after the stale atmosphere of the courthouse, and I looked up at the North Carolina sky, turning shades of purple and gold. Ren and Milo were waiting at home, with a neighbor probably anxious for news they were too young to fully understand. Tonight I would tell them that the wolf was in a cage, that the man with the lemon head was safe, that they could sleep without nightmares. Tomorrow I would begin the work of teaching them that family isn't always defined by blood, that boundaries are acts of love, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it costs you everything. But tonight I would just hold them and be grateful for the breath in my lungs and the beating of my heart. The trial was over. The healing could begin. Does a father ever truly finish burying a son? Or do the shovels just get heavier with every year? The prison sentence adds to his life. The heavy oak doors had swung shut behind Corbin weeks ago. And since that day I had lived in a hollowed-out version of my own existence. The jury's verdict had provided the truth, but it hadn't provided peace. Now, the morning of the sentencing hearing had arrived, carrying with it a different kind of tension. Not the sharp panic of the trial, but a cold, heavy finality that settled into my bones as I dressed in my best suit. I felt like a man walking toward a ledge, knowing that once the judge spoke, the son I had raised would be officially replaced by a number in a database. The courtroom was darker and less crowded than it had been during the trial, the media circus having moved on to fresher blood. I sat behind the prosecution table, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, to hide the slight tremor I couldn't seem to shake. Corbin was led in the clink of his shackles, echoing against the wood paneling. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, his face a mask of sullen resentment. Judge Morrison, a woman whose face was as stern as the North Carolina statutes she upheld, sat beneath the state seal, her eyes showing no room for the defendant's excuses. She began to speak, her voice cutting through the clinical silence of the room. She spoke of the sacred trust between a parent and child, and how Corbin had not only broken that trust, but had weaponized it. 20 years, she said, and the dry, heavy thud of the gavel followed her words like a thunderclap. 20 years in central prison, with no possibility of parole for 13. You didn't just target a life, Mr. Garrison, you targeted the concept of family. 20 years, that's 7,300 days of silence. I watched Corbin's back, waiting for a slump of defeat or a bowed head of remorse. Instead, I heard a sharp, audible intake of breath, not from sorrow, but from the pure narcissistic shock that his charm had finally failed to buy him a shorter leash. He twisted in his seat, his eyes finding mine for a split second, burning with a venom that made my heart ache. 13 years, I'll be 60. You're killing me anyway, Dad, he hissed as the bailiffs moved in to lead him away. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just watched him go, feeling the scar of his betrayal itch with a phantom pain that I knew would never truly subside. As I exited the courthouse, I expected a sense of relief, but I was met with a gauntlet of judgment. A wall of cameras blocked my path, the blinding flickering lights of news teams making me squint as I navigated the steps. But it wasn't just the media. A small group of protesters stood near the curb, holding signs that read, "Family over everything," and "Betrayer of blood." I recognized a few of them, former associates of Gale and friends of Corbin, who still believed the narrative of the successful son and the confused father. Mr. Garrison, how do you sleep knowing your son is in central prison because of your recording? A young reporter shouted, shoving a microphone toward my face. I stopped, my resolve hardening into a shield of defiant isolation. I sleep knowing my grandchildren aren't eating arsenic for breakfast, I replied, my voice carrying the authority of a principal who was finished with excuses. Why is it that the world forgives a son for murder faster than it forgives a father for the truth? I saw the judgmental glares of people I had known for decades, the social freezing of Chapel Hill beginning to settle over me like a winter frost. I realized then that in the court of public opinion, the father who breaks the silence is often seen as the greater villain. I drove home in a daze, the weight of the day pressing against my chest. But the betrayal wasn't finished. When I checked my phone, I found a series of notifications from local community groups. Links were being shared to a blog post, claiming that my medical records had been leaked, suggesting I was suffering from early onset dementia, and had hallucinated the entire plot. The source was anonymous, but the details pointed to one person, I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that Gail had been the primary source feeding the fire of my public execution, even as our nephew was being processed into a cell. I arrived at my house and felt the siege mentality take hold. My mailbox was stuffed with anonymous hate mail, the envelopes thick with the bile of strangers. I walked up the driveway, my eyes catching a glint of light on the porch. A brick lay in the center of my kitchen floor, surrounded by a spray of shattered glass that crunched under my shoes like frozen snow. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of cold winter air coming through the broken side window, and looked at the brick. It was wrapped in a printout of an old family photo one from Corbin's 10th birthday. It was a day I'd spent teaching him how to hit a curveball, both of us laughing in the summer sun. The gritty texture of the brick felt like a personal insult against my skin. The brick didn't just break the glass, it shattered the last illusion that my retirement would be peaceful. I realized that my quest for justice had made my home a target for the very community I had served for 30 years. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a story where the father is always the hero and the son is always the victim. I sat at my kitchen table, the glass still crunching under my slippers, and opened the final envelope from the mail pile. It was from Corbin's defense attorney. They were already filing an appeal claiming new evidence regarding my mental state had come to light. The war wasn't over. It was just changing shape. I looked at the photo of the young boy on the brick, then at the shattered window, and I knew that the surgery to save my family had left a wound that would require a lifetime to heal. Now, I was the one standing at the plate and the world was throwing stones. A house without sound isn't peaceful. It's a tomb where the words my grandson used to say are buried under a layer of fear that I can't seem to dig him out of. I spent the morning following the sentencing hearing, in the heavy silence of Milo's room, watching the sun crawl across the floorboards with the patience of something that had all the time in the world while we had none. The vandalism in the kitchen, the brick, the glass, the shattered memories had been swept away by Leonie's determined hands, but the atmosphere of the siege remained like a fog that refused to lift. I had done my duty as a father and as a citizen, standing in that courtroom and watching my son be led away in chains. But as I looked at the boy sitting cross-legged on his rug, I felt the crushing weight of a hollow victory. What good was justice if it cost me the sound of my grandson's laughter? I attempted to engage Milo during our weekend breakfast, the smell of cold blueberries and damp paper from his sketchbook, filling the small space between us like a barrier made of ordinary things. "Milo, do you want the blueberries today?" I asked, my voice cracking at the silence that followed. He didn't look up. He only offered a slow, rhythmic nod, his hand never stopping the frantic scratching of his crayons on the table. The sound was both comforting and heartbreaking. At least he was still creating still, expressing something even if words had become too dangerous to speak. Leonie sat across from us, her eyes reflecting a weariness that matched my own, the dark circles beneath them, testament to nights spent listening for sounds that never came. "He's not being stubborn." "Thane," she whispered, her hand covering mine, with a warmth that felt like the only real thing in the room. "He's just locked the door from the inside, and he's lost the key." A classmate had called his father a killer during recess the previous week, and the boy had retreated into a fortress of mutism ever since, building walls that even my love couldn't seem to scale. I felt a chilling sense of exposure when I looked down at the drawing Milo had just finished and pushed aside. It showed a man with a lemon for a head being chased by a massive snarling wolf, proving Milo remembers the cake from that March morning in 2021 more vividly than anyone realized. The detail was extraordinary and disturbing. The lemon-headed figure's mouth was open in a silent scream, and the wolf's teeth were dripping with what looked like frosting. The trauma wasn't just a news story to him. It was a physical monster that had tried to swallow his grandfather and now lived rent-free in his 6-year-old imagination. I realized that my pursuit of justice, while necessary, had created collateral damage that my inheritance could never easily fix. The war inside my grandson's mind was a battlefield where I felt completely unarmed, a place where my decades of educational psychology training meant nothing against the primal fear that had taken root in his soul. Milo's silence wasn't a wall. It was an ocean, and I was just a man with a bucket trying to drain it. I spent the rest of the morning in my home office, the phone buzzing with notifications from local community groups that still painted me as a monster, a vindictive father who had destroyed his own son's life out of spite rather than necessity. The comment sections were brutal. What kind of man sends his own flesh and blood to prison? And he should have handled this privately. But amidst the bile, a different kind of call came through. It was a neighbor 3 streets over, a woman named Patricia, whom I had known through the PTA years ago. She was sobbing, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush as she explained that her son had just convinced her to sign over her house deed under the guise of a tax form, the same predatory tactic Corbin had used on Leonie. She was begging for help that the police, hampered by the voluntary nature of the signature, couldn't provide. The law saw a woman who had signed a document. It didn't see the web of manipulation that had led her there. I realized in that moment that I held a unique position. I had the educational background of a principal who understood bureaucracy and the systems that both protected and failed vulnerable people. I had the legal allies in Benedict who knew every loophole and every weapon in the arsenal of elder law. And now I had the personal inheritance that Corbin had tried to steal, money that felt tainted by his greed but could be purified through purpose. I didn't have to just be a victim. I could be a shield. I contacted Maria Santos, a sharp-eyed social worker with a decade of experience in elder law and a reputation for never backing down from a fight along with Benedict. I want to make sure no other principals in this town are made to feel like burdens by their own blood. I told them, my voice steady, with a conviction I hadn't felt since the trial. Benedict warned me that it was a big undertaking, that foundations required paperwork and oversight and a level of public scrutiny I might not be ready for. But I didn't care. Spite is a powerful fuel, but love is a better engine, and I had plenty of both. By early 2022, the paperwork was ready. I met Maria Santos at a small rented office space in Chapel Hill, a former insurance office that still smelled faintly of old carpet and broken dreams. The air was stale and dust-heavy, but the bright blue glare of the Foundation's new website on Maria's laptop felt like a lighthouse cutting through fog. We sat at a folding table that wobbled slightly, reviewing the mission statement for the Garrison Foundation for Elder Protection. The words felt like a manifesto. To protect seniors from financial abuse by family members through education, legal intervention, and community support. I pulled out my checkbook, the cold, smooth plastic of the cover, feeling like a badge of office, a symbol of the transformation I was about to undergo. My son wanted this money to disappear into a poker game. I said, the ink of my pen biting into the paper with a satisfying scratch. I'm going to make sure it stays right here, protecting people like me and Patricia and every other senior who thought family loyalty meant never saying no. I signed the initial $200,000 endowment check from the inheritance money that had been meant for my retirement, for quiet days on the porch and trips to see grandchildren. The pen didn't shake this time. It bit into the check like a wolf claiming territory. As I handed it to Maria, the weight of the community's judgment seemed to lift, slightly replaced by the heavy, grounding responsibility of my new role. Welcome to the fight, mister. Chairman Maria, said her firm handshake, grounding me in the present. I was no longer just the man whose son tried to kill him. I was the architect of a system that would ensure nobody else had to face that darkness alone. Maria revealed that our first anonymous donation of $10,000 had already come in, arriving the same day we filed the incorporation papers. It was from a former business associate of Corbin's, a man who admitted in a typed note that he felt guilty for not reporting Corbin's erratic, predatory behavior months before the poisoning in March 2021. He had seen the warning signs, the desperation in Corbin's eyes at business lunches, the way he would disappear to take phone calls from unknown numbers, the gradual unraveling of his polished facade, but had convinced himself it wasn't his place to interfere. The money was a reminder that the rot had been visible to many, and I had simply been the one most blinded by love. But now that same love was being channeled into something that could save others from my mistakes. As my phone buzzed with an alert from Milo's therapist, the high-stakes reality of my life came crashing back. While I was building a fortress for the world, my own grandson was still trapped in the ruins of the first explosion. I grabbed my keys, the metal clinking with a frantic urgency that matched my heartbeat. The Foundation could wait an hour. The man with the lemon head was still being chased in Milo's mind, and I was the only one who could tell him the wolf was finally behind bars, locked away where he could never hurt us again. A child's voice is like the morning sun. You don't realize how much of your world is in freezing darkness until the first light finally breaks through the clouds. I stood outside the heavy door of Dr. Sarah Kim's office, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of rain against the window. For months, Milo had been a ghost in his own skin, communicating only through the scratch of crayons and somber nods. But today, the alert on my phone hadn't been a warning. It had been an invitation. Dr. Kim's message simply reading, "Come now, you'll want to see this." I found Milo sitting at a small table, hunched over a hand-painted ceramic bank. It was a new one, but he had painted it to look exactly like the one Corbin had smashed: the blue glaze, the little silver stars, the defiant posture of Commander Coin. He reached out a small, trembling finger and touched the seam where the clay met, tracing the imperfect line where Dr. Kim had helped him glue the pieces back together. "Grandpa?" "I fixed it," he whispered. The sound was so small, so fragile that I almost missed it. But it was their 2 words that carried the weight of months of silence. My legs felt weak as I sank into the chair beside him, my hand reaching out to rest gently on his shoulder. "You did, Milo," I replied, my own voice thick with overwhelming joy and tears I didn't bother to hide. "You fixed the most important thing of all, Doctor." Kim explained from her position near the window that the physical act of gluing the shards back together had allowed him to finally process the betrayal, to take something broken and make it whole, again not perfect but functional, scarred but standing. He wasn't just fixing a toy, he was reclaiming his home, his sense of safety, his belief that broken things could be made beautiful again. He spoke. The world didn't stop, but mine finally started spinning again. The relief was a physical weight leaving my chest, allowing me to breathe for the first time since the trial ended. I spent the next hour just listening to him, the stuttering, beautiful music of a child rediscovering his own power. He told me about the wolf in his dreams, about how it had grown smaller each week, about how now it was just a puppy that he could pet. He told me he wanted to help other kids whose families were broken like Commander Coin. And in that moment, I knew the foundation wasn't just for Patricia and the other seniors, it was for Milo too, a way to transform his trauma into purpose. By mid-2022, the Garrison Foundation for Elder Protection was no longer just incorporation papers gathering dust in Benedict's office. It was a functioning machine of justice with 3 full-time staff members, and a hotline that rang constantly. Maria Santos walked into my office one afternoon, carrying a folder that felt like a trophy when she handed it to me. We had successfully recovered $50,000 for a 90-year-old widow who had been scammed by her own grandson, using a combination of legal pressure and community advocacy that had made the local news. "We didn't just get the money back, Thane. We got her dignity back," Maria said, her smile fierce with pride. I nodded, looking out the window at the Chapel Hill skyline, the university spires reaching toward a sky that felt less heavy than it had 6 months ago. "That's the only currency that matters now." Benedict had called earlier to inform me of the news. The new evidence Gale and Corbin's team had tried to use for their appeal was dead. The private investigator Gale hired was caught attempting to bribe a nurse to alter my medical records, trying to create a paper trail that would support their narrative of my supposed cognitive decline. The court had rejected the appeal entirely, leaving Corbin exactly where he belonged. The judge had been particularly harsh, noting that the attempt to manufacture evidence only reinforced the original verdict. Later that evening, I joined Leonie and the children for dinner at a local restaurant, a family-owned Italian place that had survived 3 generations and countless recessions. The room was filled with the warm golden glow of candlelight and happy conversations, the smell of garlic and fresh bread wrapping around us like an embrace. I watched Leonie introduce me to Tom, a man she had been seeing quietly for a few months, her cheeks flushed with a happiness I hadn't seen since before that March morning. Tom, a man in his mid-40s with a gentle smile and the patient demeanor of a career educator, offered a firm, respectful handshake. "Any friend of Leonie's is a member of this table," I said, motioning for him to sit, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The restaurant wasn't just serving dinner. It was serving a fresh start, and for the first time in over a year, I had an appetite for something other than justice. I watched Ren and Milo laughing at something. Tom said a terrible dad joke about pasta that shouldn't have been funny, but somehow was the Garrison name now belonging to the survivors, not the perpetrator. As the night progressed, Tom revealed a detail that made me smile. He was a former educator who had once worked under me when I was a young principal 20 years ago. He spoke of how my emphasis on integrity and standing up for vulnerable students had shaped his own career, how he had carried those lessons into his own classroom and tried to build the same culture of accountability and care. The kindness I had sown decades ago was now coming back to support my family's future in ways I could never have imagined. I raised my glass to Tom and Leonie, the warmth of the room acting as a balm for my scarred heart. We were no longer a family in hiding, we were a family in bloom, growing toward light that had seemed impossible just months before. But as we laughed, I felt a sudden familiar chill, like a shadow passing over the sun. I thought of the white envelope I had seen on my mahogany desk that morning, a letter with a Department of Corrections stamp and Corbin's inmate number in the corner. My son had finally reached out from the state penitentiary after months of silence. I looked at the happy faces around the table and made a silent vow. I would read the letter, but I wouldn't let the shadow it carried darken the light we had finally found. Whatever Corbin had to say, it would not steal this moment from us. Not this time. Not ever again. Time is a strange architect. It can turn the jagged ruins of a betrayal into a cathedral of purpose, but it can never quite mask the scent of the smoke that started it all. I sat in my study, the late afternoon sun spilling across the mahogany desk, and looked at the white envelope with a Department of Corrections stamp. It was the third letter I had received from Corbin in 4 years, but the first one I hadn't immediately considered burning. After nearly half a decade of rebuilding my life from the ashes he left behind, I finally felt insulated enough to handle the heat. 4 years had passed since the courtroom doors swung shut in September 2021, and the Garrison name had undergone a transformation I never thought possible. The Garrison Foundation for Elder Protection had recovered over $2 million for victims of financial abuse and helped enact Thane's Law in North Carolina, a legislative shield that now protected thousands of seniors from the kind of predatory greed my son had mastered. Ren was thriving in high school, already talking about pursuing law to perhaps one day carry the sword I had forged, and Milo, now a resilient 11-year-old, had become an advocate for trauma recovery in his school community. He still kept that blue glued-together piggy bank on his shelf, a trophy of a childhood that had been broken but meticulously repaired. Have you ever looked at a calendar and realized that 4 years is both an eternity and a heartbeat? We weren't just survivors anymore, we were the infrastructure of safety. 2 years earlier, we faced a retaliatory fraud complaint from Brian Thompson, the son of a man we helped convict. It was a 3-month legal nightmare designed to see us blink. Benedict and Maria stood by me as we navigated the audit, which led to complete exoneration and a surge in public support. The community that once threw a brick through my window in late 2021 now sends anonymous donations to keep our doors open. The foundation had become more than a legal entity. It was a living testament to the power of choosing purpose over bitterness. I finally picked up the letter. The rough institutional texture of the prison stationery felt alien against my skin. Corbin's previous letters had been demands for money or appeals for me to use my influence to reduce his sentence. This one was different. It was humble. It didn't ask for a check. It asked for a face-to-face meeting. He wrote about accountability, a word I never thought he was capable of spelling, let alone feeling. He mentioned his first upcoming parole hearing and said he couldn't face the board until he faced the man he had tried to erase. The letter included a small hand-drawn sketch of a lemon tree, a callback to the cake from the March morning in 2021, but with a note underneath that read, "I'm learning to plant instead of pick." Those words hit me harder than any apology could have. They suggested not just remorse, but transformation. I spent 6 weeks in deliberation. I consulted Dr. Sarah Kim, who had become more than just Milo's therapist. She had become a steady voice of wisdom for our entire family. I held a quiet council with Leonie, who listened with the patience of someone who had walked through her own fire and emerged stronger. Tom, who had become a steady, gentle pillar in our family, simply told me that I wasn't going there for Corbin. "You aren't going there for him," Thane Leonie said, her sharp blue eyes seeing through to my core. "You're going there to see if you can finally let go of the man you were in 2021. She was right. My healing required one final confrontation with the man in the orange jumpsuit. I needed to see the wolf in the cage to realize that I was no longer the prey. I needed to close the chapter not with rage but with clarity. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Central Prison in Raleigh. "This is Thane Garrison." I said the name, sounding solid and untarnished in the stillness of the room. "I'd like to schedule a visitation for late October 2025. The sharp click of the pen on the other end echoed like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. The appointment was set. There was no turning back now. The steel door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed through the last 4 years of my life. I stood in the intake area of Central Prison, the smell of industrial disinfectant and stale anxiety coating the back of my throat. It was a cold, biting October afternoon in 2025. I had spent nearly half a decade avoiding this place, convincing myself that justice was enough. But as I followed the guard down the narrow, fluorescent-lit corridor toward the visitation room, I realized that justice is a legal term, while closure is a spiritual one. The metallic clang of doors locking behind me at each checkpoint reminded me that I was walking voluntarily into a space my son could never leave. I entered the visitation room and found Corbin waiting on the other side of the reinforced glass partition. The man sitting there was a stranger, gray-haired, thin, and stripped of the tailored arrogance that once defined him. The expensive watch was gone, replaced by the plain institutional uniform that erased all traces of the hedge fund manager he had pretended to be. For 90 minutes, we talked not as predator and prey, but as two men examining the wreckage of a shared history. Corbin didn't lead with excuses. He admitted full responsibility for the poisoning and the theft of Milo's piggy bank, offering a raw, unvarnished apology without once asking for a reduction in his sentence. "I used to think you were the burden, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. "I realize now that I was the anchor dragging us all to the bottom." I watched his hands tremble as he spoke, and I saw not the monster who had crushed pills into frosting, but a broken man who had finally begun to understand the weight of what he had done. He didn't look like a monster anymore. He just looked like a man who had run out of time. I felt a strange, somber grace wash over me. I still loved the boy I raised, Corbin. But I finally loved myself enough to keep the man you became far away from my heart, I told him. The glass between us felt symbolic, a necessary boundary that allowed connection without harm. During our conversation, he revealed something I never expected. He confessed that he had actually drafted a letter to the police the night before the cake delivery in March 2021, admitting to the financial fraud and the gambling debts. But his addiction and the fear of the loan sharks had won out, and he had burned the confession in my own fireplace while I slept upstairs. He had a conscience, however, buried it was under the greed. Knowing that he had almost chosen the light didn't change the past, but it allowed me to forgive the memory of the son I thought I knew. It gave me permission to grieve the boy he could have been while accepting the man he had become. Is it possible to forgive someone without letting them back into your life? I think it's the only way to survive. When the guards signaled the end of our time, I didn't feel the weight of the prison walls. I felt the lightness of a man who had finally put down a heavy shovel. We didn't hug. The glass partition made that impossible, but we shared a brief, firm acknowledgement, his hand pressed against the glass mine, mirroring it on my side. It was a recognition of a shared life that was now officially over. I walked out of that prison into the crisp evening air, the sunset painting the North Carolina hills in shades of bruised purple and gold. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves, and for the first time in years, I breathed it in without feeling the phantom smell of that poison lemon cake. I returned to my home in Chapel Hill to find the driveway full of cars. Leonie, Tom, Ren, and Milo were all there waiting with a quiet celebratory dinner. The house was full of the smell of roast chicken and the sound of Ren's laughter as she recounted a story from her debate team practice. I saw Milo sitting at the kitchen table, proudly showing Tom his new unbroken piggy bank, not the glued-together memorial, but a fresh one he had bought with his own allowance. It was a simple ceramic pig, but it was whole. How was he? Grandpa Milo asked, his voice steady and clear, no trace of the mutism that had once imprisoned him. I pulled him into a hug, breathing in the smell of his shampoo and the innocence he had fought so hard to reclaim. He's exactly where he needs to be, Milo, and so are we. In the early hours of a December morning, not long after I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon and my journal, the sunrise was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I wrote down the final ledger of my life, 10 lessons about love boundaries and the necessity of saying no. God gave us boundaries for a reason. They aren't walls to keep love out, but guardrails to keep love healthy. I reflected on the thousands of people we had saved from the same darkness that nearly took me in March of 2021. This is the legacy that matters. Not the years I spent as a principal, not the modest savings I accumulated, but the fortress I built to protect others from predatory greed disguised as family love. If you're waiting for a sign to set a boundary with someone you love, let my story be that sign. Don't wait for the poison. I closed the journal as I heard Leonie's car pulling into the driveway for our traditional Saturday breakfast, the children trailing behind with a box of fresh pastries from the bakery, downtown ironically the same one that had made Corbin's poison cake, though under new ownership now. I took one last look at the Golden Garrison nameplate on my gate. It didn't belong to the thief in the orange jumpsuit anymore. It belonged to us, the survivors who knew that the most expensive gift you can ever give is the truth. I revealed in my final journal entry a secret I hadn't told even Leonie. I had structured the Foundation's bylaws so that if Corbin ever truly rehabilitates after his release, he will have a job waiting for him as a janitor, not as a lawyer, not as a manager, but as someone who cleans up messes, a daily physical reminder of the work required to rebuild trust. He will have to earn his way back into the family name through service rather than inheritance. It was my final act as a principal and a father, providing a path back to integrity, but only for those willing to do the work. The job would pay minimum wage, require weekly counseling, and demand absolute transparency. It was a bridge I was building not out of weakness, but out of the stubborn belief that redemption, while rare, should never be completely impossible. I turned toward the door, ready to join the family I had chosen. Ren was setting the table. Milo was pouring orange juice with the careful concentration of a child determined not to spill, and Leonie was laughing at something Tom had said. The story was complete. I was a man at peace, and for the first time in my 76 years, the silence of the morning felt like a blessing rather than a void. The lemon tree in my backyard, planted 2 years earlier as a deliberate act of reclamation, was beginning to bear fruit. I would never bake with those lemons, but I would watch them grow, a reminder that even the most bitter seeds can produce something beautiful if given enough time, patience, and the right soil. Looking back now, I understand that my life became a painful family story I never imagined telling. For years, I believed that love alone could fix everything, that silence, patience, and sacrifice would protect the people I cared about. But this family story taught me something different. Love without boundaries can become permission for betrayal. If there is one lesson I want to share, it is this: do not ignore the quiet warnings in your heart just because someone shares your blood. Even a dad revenge journey like mine was never about hatred. It was about protecting the innocent when the truth finally surfaced. I often ask myself what I would do differently if I could go back. I would speak sooner. I would ask harder questions. And I would remember that protecting your family sometimes means standing against them. This family story reminds me that justice and compassion must exist together. My dad revenge was never about destroying my son. It was about saving my grandchildren from the consequences of his choices. In the end, I believe God allowed this storm to shape me into someone stronger, someone who finally understood that forgiveness does not mean surrender. If my experience means anything, let it be this: do not wait for disaster before you set boundaries. Sometimes a dad revenge is not revenge at all. It is simply the courage to stand up for what is right. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd truly appreciate hearing your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in my place facing such a difficult family dilemma? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories like this one. A small note: while inspired by real-world themes and situations, certain elements in this narrative have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this style of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that might suit your interests better.